Мы начинаем. После торжественной официальной части мы приступаем к работе. So the first speaker, I would like to introduce him, and I've prepared some notes. Since the first time I touched the problem of language-music relation, I have seen a reference to the work by Pesetsky and Jonah Katz, and that work appeared in 2009, and I've made this reference in every paper I have read and in every conference presentation I have heard. What's surprising, this work has never been published, but at the same time, it has been downloaded and cited more than 6,000 times. 6,000 times. And the title of this work is Identity Thesis for Language and Music, and this thesis is the following. All formal differences between language and music are a consequence of differences in their fundamental building blocks. In all other aspects, language and music are identical. In 2015, at the first workshop on language, music and computing, we had the honor to invite David Pesetsky as our keynote speaker. And finally today, we are happy to welcome his famous co-author, Dr. Jonah Katz. Please welcome. Just a moment.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, for having invited me here, for putting the conference on. Today I'm going to be talking about grouping in music and language, and this will be at least tangentially related to my earlier work with David Pesetsky, although it's gone in a kind of different direction these days. I'm not sure how to advance the slides. Okay. Is there a button here that advance the slides?
I don't know.
So today I'm going to be briefly reviewing the nature of grouping in music and language. And in language, this is often going to be referred to as prosodic phrasing, but it basically means the same thing in both domains. So broadly construed, we can say that speech and music both involve sequences of events. Speech events are musical events. And that, crucially, some events pattern together to the exclusion of other events in linguistic and musical computations with regard to their perceived coherence and possibly their acoustic patterning. And so I'll be examining the high-level computational properties of these systems, as well as briefly later in the talk, I'll have something to say about actual processing and algorithmic implementations of these. So I'm going to be broadly focused on three aspects of grouping in both the linguistic and the musical domains. The first question will be, what do grouping structures look like? What is the final form of the theory that governs structural relations in these two domains? What is the evidence for how we got there? What's the rationale for positing those grouping structures? And finally, what is the relationship between grouping and acoustic properties or auditory properties within each domain? So sort of starting points for the review here, these are going to be high-level reviews of both domains that need up significant amounts of detail and get sort of streamlined. But basically I'll be assuming something like the classic prosodic hierarchy theory, familiar from generative linguistics, for language, and something like the generative theory of tonal music, theory of grouping from the musical domain. And I'll try to introduce each of these from the ground up, but this is basically the background for the reviews that I'm going to be giving. Offer you a preview of where we're going, or where I'm going to end up in this talk. I'll say that there are broad similarities between linguistic and musical grouping. So there's a law-governed relationship between auditory or acoustic phrasing and syntactic or semantic representations in each domain. There's going to be hierarchical, exhaustive, and layered constituency in music and in language. And there will be some sort of alignment with auditory continuity and disruption along broadly Gestalt grouping lines in both domains. That said, there's also going to be important differences between musical and linguistic grouping. And the source of these similarities can only be as clear as our understanding of where each of these formal properties comes from internal to each domain. So why is musical grouping organized the way it is instead of some other way? Why is linguistic grouping organized the way it is instead of some other way? And there's going to be significant uncertainty here. So in some sense, have more questions than answers today. It's going to be correspondingly unclear to what extent we can say that grouping in music and language are the same, or what it would even mean for them to be the same. But nonetheless, I hope we'll be able to frame the question more clearly at the end. So I'll start off with language, and any whirlwind overview of human language is necessarily going to gloss some things over and leave out some details. I'm going to give some generalizations about prosodic structure here. None of these are meant to be exhaustive or universal, but these are what I see as some very, very broad trends cross-linguistically in how prosodic phrasing is organized. And so the fundamental argument for positing prosodic structure or grouping structure in language in the first place, as I understand it, is first of all related to linguistic sound systems. So every language has context-dependent differences in the acoustic realization of some abstract sound category, like phonemes or whatever your equivalent of those is. Some of those patterns will require reference to constituents at various levels. And the location of constituent boundaries, as recovered from these sound patterns, stands in a law-governed relationship to syntactic structure. This is the claim. And of course, there are other factors that affect prosody and prosodic phrasing beyond syntax. I'm not meaning to limit the factors that go into prosodic phrasing to syntax narrowly, but syntax is one factor in defining where these groupings end up. So here's an example of a kind of prosodic parse that might be assigned to a linguistic utterance. And this is a more or less random sentence of English. It's meant to be a more or less typical utterance of the form, the child in front discovered an object. So that's the English sentence we're modeling here. I've written in the middle the IPA transcription of the phonemes involved, parsed into syllables, further parsed into morphosyntactic words, and I've added a couple layers of plausible prosodic structure on top of this. This is not the only possible prosodic structure for this sentence. You can utter sentences in a number of different ways, but this is a plausible way of producing the sentence. Above the IPA text here, I've put in linguistic bracketing notation, which is showing hierarchical levels of grouping at the syllable, prosodic word, phonological phrase, and utterance level. And then below this, I've just rewritten those bracketings in more of the GTTM musical grouping notation. And they're saying the exact same thing. These are formal equivalents, these two notations, but they're just drawn differently in two domains. There's some formal properties of these grouping structures. So sounds are exhaustively partitioned into groups. We have no partial overlap between levels of grouping here. There tends to be a strong tendency towards binarity within prosodic systems of many languages. This is true especially above the word level. This particular diagram has left out the labels that are traditionally associated with prosodic theory in language, and that is in and of itself a hypothesis that perhaps the labels are not doing any important work in linguistic prosodic theory. And the main question is going to be, well, so I'm telling you, this is a typical sentence of some language, and this is the kind of structure that we assign to it. How did we get there? Why do we think this structure exists, right? What kinds of sound patterns are going to motivate this? And so here I'm going to single out one particular class of prosodically conditioned sound patterns across languages that I think are very, very common in all language families of the world, not just in English. So looking across languages, we find that many languages will lengthen the final element of groups at various levels. This is one kind of evidence people use when positing prosodic structures. In English, we're going to find successively longer vowels at the ends of words, smaller prosodic groups, and larger prosodic groups. This kind of final lengthening at various levels of hierarchical constituency is widely attested across the world's languages and the world's language families. So I have a partial list here of other languages from other families where this kind of prosodic lengthening is attested. And it's extremely broad tendency, not universal, but extremely broad. In English, at least, these effects are not at all subtle. You sort of jump out of the data and punch it in the face. So this is a cute example here that relies on particular ambiguity in English. This is a long subject that ends with the word saw as a noun and is immediately followed by a predicate with the word saw as a verb. And the observation here is that the instance of saw that is final in the subject phrase here, which is the first instance of saw, is roughly twice as long as the instance of saw that follows it. I have audio here, I'm not really sure. Well, in any case, I can give you a rendition of this. The sentence is something like, "The man with the saw my porch needed fixing." And the observation here is just that the token of this word saw that occurs in a phrase final position is much, much longer than the one that occurs in a phrase initial position. And this is not a subtle effect at all. These effects are going to be many, many standard deviations, and they're not hard to recover from linguistic data. Many languages also lengthen the initial elements of groups at various levels, and this is yet another type of evidence or empirical data that drives prosodic theory. This is more common with consonants, although it's also known to affect vowels in some ways. It's going to be true of both articulatory and acoustic measurements. And this lengthening at the initial levels of phrases is often accompanied by a suite of articulatory strengthening effects, which I'll discuss in a few slides from now. But right now I'm just talking about length. So amongst the languages where this has been attested with either articulatory or acoustic data, English, Korean, Guinji, an Australian language, French, Taiwanese, Japanese, Campaniese, Sardinian. This is my own research recently. And this is very, very common to have longer consonants at the beginnings of successively larger prosodic groups, and it is in and of itself that constitutes evidence for some sort of hierarchical prosodic grouping. Beyond this lengthening of all sorts of elements at the beginnings and endings of groups, many languages also have a tendency towards more extreme pitches and pitch movements near the beginnings and endings of groups. These are generally referred to as edge tones, and they often pertain to the illocutionary force of speech acts. So is this a question, a statement, a command? They tend to agglutinate at the edges of constituents, so higher levels of grouping, higher levels of constituency will be associated with more edge tones, which in turn will entail more extreme F0 values or F0 movements. So a couple examples here. I should say, before I show these examples, there are many, many linguistic factors that will influence F0, including stress, accent, and lexical tone. Prosodic phrasing is not the only effect on F0, obviously, but this is one particularly common pattern with regard to prosodic phrasing. So edge tones are tested independently of stress, independently of pitch accent, and independently of lexical tone. They can be present or absent in the presence of any of these other linguistic elements. Edge tones exist in languages with stress and with pitch accent, like English, Bengali, and Japanese, also in languages without stress or accent. So Korean and Sri Lankan Malay are two examples of languages that are said not to have stress or accent, yet do have prosodic edge tones. And also, these edge tones appear in languages with contrastive lexical tone, including almost all Bantu languages have edge tones as well. that are, in some sense, superimposed on their lexical tone systems. Here's a look at agglutinative edge tones in Seoul, Korean. There's something a little bit wrong with the graphic here. I think I must have inserted this in the document in a strange way that it's having trouble reading. What this would show, if it had been reproduced properly by me, is basically two Korean sentences, one of which is a single intonational phrase, and the other one of which is a comparable length sentence, but is split into multiple syntactic phrases. And what you get is a pitch reset within each prosodic phrase. You cannot see this on the screen right now because the graphic has been reproduced in a weird way. But this would show you that every time there's a prosodic break in the middle of the sentence, you get a large rise in tone, which then declines over the rest of the prosodic constituent until the next prosodic constituent begins again. Beyond these pitch and length effects, we find this tendency for consonants to be longer and less vowel-like at the edges of groups, shorter and more vowel-like medially. And again, this is not universal, and it's not the only kind of prosodic effect we find, but it is a particularly common one. So this includes the initial strengthening effects that I mentioned earlier in a number of languages, as well as many sound patterns that get described as lenition fortition patterns. So this would include spiralization and voicing. And in fact, there's a hypothesis out there that I've advanced in my own work that some of these patterns, lenition fortition patterns, may be organized specifically to reinforce grouping boundaries. This is something I've argued in my own work. Patricia Keating and John Kingston have argued similar things in their work. So just an example of the medial lenition of a particular consonant in Campidonesia Sardinian. I'm just trying to illustrate what this type of lenition fortition pattern looks like. And here I've given you a sequence of phones that spans a phrase boundary. And the form of the sentence is, I swim, prosodic break, every time that I go to the beach. What you can see here is that there's two underlying voice-supported stops, just sounds. They're right next to each other here. And the one that's medial in a phrase, this form, analu, is realized as an approximate. You can see clear form and structure. Right here. The one that appears at the beginning of a large prosodic phrase in Donyota, which is shown to the right in this diagram, is produced with total closure, with silence, with a stop burst. It's much more consonantal and much more vowel-like. So it's going to be much more disruptive to the acoustic energy and speech stream when it appears at the beginning of a prosodic constituent than when it appears medially. Prosodic constituent. There it is. So this is just the two stops next to each other, one of which is very vowel-like. It continues the flow of acoustic energy within the phrase. The other one of which is very disruptive and consonant-like. So this is my basic overview of prosodic grouping in language. Not all prosodic patterns fall under this rubric of disruption-related phenomena, but many, many prosodic patterns in language tend to create disruption at the edges of prosodic constituents while preserving acoustic and auditory continuity internal to those constituents. Move on now to music. Again, we'll ask first, why do we think that there's musical grouping structure to begin with? And the claim here is that every piece of music has some set of units that are perceived as more coherent, continuous, or complete than other units. And the placement of these grouping units stands in a law-governed relationship to acoustic properties of the musical surface. So this is the claim from all of the experimental and theoretical literature of musical grouping. There's a further claim here that the units picked out by these grouping perception studies bear a law-governed relationship to the units that figure in memory, memory-related processing, in the interpretation of harmony or of tonality in different pieces of music. So the claim is not just that we can split the musical surface into acoustic groups, but that those groups are good for something, that they're important to the analysis of musical pieces. So yeah, this phrase, units that figure in memory, harmony, and or tonal interpretation, this notion has been much less well worked out than in language, I think it's fair to say. But it's still a necessary part of grouping. So without this idea that the groups we can pick out using auditory disruption or using perceptual properties in music, the observation that if you force listeners to split streams of music into pieces that they can do it is not very interesting in and of itself. It's only if you can show that those chunks do something, right, that this becomes an interesting hypothesis. This is a little bit harder to do in music because we don't have any kind of broad-based agreement on what the syntactic or semantic structures of music are, but it's still possible to find some evidence for these groups feeding further processing or further computations. So this is an example from an American folk song called Turkey in the Straw. I like to use simple musical examples and also ones that are not associated with any words, because linguistic grouping will often intrude on musical grouping in these examples. And I'm giving you one possible parse of this simple folk tune. Again, just up on a par with the linguistic example, this is one possible grouping structure that you might assign to this tune. I have audio of this as well. You can try this. There might well be a number of different ways you can split this up into prosodic groups. I've chosen one here that I can see as a plausible way of hearing this. Of course, it could be a probability distribution over different parses. Just as in the linguistic example here, what we seem to see from this final state computational theory of this grouping process is an exhaustive partition of sounds. Again, with no partial overlap between groups at different levels. Full containment here. Again, a strong tendency towards binarity in this component, at least at higher levels of grouping. And as with language, we can ask, well, what kinds of sound patterns motivated these groups to begin with? You're telling me the structure is here, but why? Why do we think this structure is here? And so, as in language, group entries here tend to be associated with relative discontinuity in acoustic terms. And this follows general Gestalt psychology principles. So that two of the Gestalt principles of grouping or segmentation are the proximity and change rules, and these seem to be particularly important for perception of musical grouping and chunking. So the proximity principle basically says that events that are far apart are likely to be perceived as contained in different units, whereas events that are closer together tend to be perceived as being internal to a single unit. The change principle says that anytime you have a large change in any perceptual property or perceptual dimension between two events, you are relatively likely to associate those events with different units. So these are just saying posit group boundaries in places where events are relatively close to one another within groups, and where events are relatively similar to one another within groups. That's basically what these are saying. So basically, in terms of the properties we talked about for language, this is going to favor groups where long notes are final in a group, because their attack points will be set off temporally from the events in the next group, and where changes in acoustic parameters tend to mark group boundaries. Unlike in language, most of the evidence that we get in the musical groups comes from perceptual data, so not from examining the production of a large number of pieces of music, but rather from experimentally manipulating grouping and asking people what they hear. So this could be introspective judgments. That's certainly the way Lerton and Jackendorf start out their theory. There have been experimental versions of that introspective judgment task in many, many studies. There's also been recall tasks that will reflect chunking or storage of these units in memory. And there's even some evidence that higher level boundaries are associated with acoustic disruption in a cumulative hierarchical manner. This is a little bit patchy, this evidence. I wouldn't say we have a huge number of studies showing this, but the ones that we have seem to be consistent with this idea that indeed listeners posit boundaries at moments of temporal or acoustic disruption, and that the larger that disruption, the higher level units they tend to posit. This seems to be what we find in this literature. How does this work? The claim in GTTM and much of the work that follows it is that there are basically mapping principles from acoustic properties onto group structures. And here I've just taken these red lines to mark out places in the musical surface where there's either some change in an acoustic property or some difference in the proximity of events that would favor a group boundary. As you can see, there are lots of possible group boundaries that these basic acoustic principles will pick out. In general, we expect a subset of these to be associated with actual grouping boundaries in the listener's parts of this. We will listen to this one more time, slow it down a bit, and you can see if you can hear where some of these principles are being applied internally to the music. So this is the claim of the grouping theory, that you start with a musical surface like this. You have acoustic mapping principles that give you candidate places for grouping boundaries. You construct parts according to some set of constraints, or probabilistically according to some set of constraints that will incorporate a subset of those acoustic breaks. That said, it's harder to get unambiguous evidence about what these groups do once you assign them a parse. And that tends to be the weakest part of the argument in music. GTTM proposes a fairly elaborate reductional analysis of pieces that rely on grouping constituency. And I'm not going to be able to outline this whole theory in a 45-minute talk, but here's an attempt to illustrate the kind of thing that groups are supposed to do within this approach. The idea here, is that, well, this is supposed to show the grouping structure that was posited earlier, as well as the final note in each group. And the claim here is that once you split this piece into groups, that those groups are useful for analyzing, in this case, the tonal properties of the piece of music. And in particular here, the claim is that the final note in each group is picking out a crucial part of the tonal interpretation of the piece of music. And so, this unfortunately did not reproduce right either. But the basic idea is that if you take the final note in each group here, which is going to be in some sense the head of that group, they outline a tonic triad progressing to a dominant chord throughout the first half of the excerpt, and then throughout the second half, again picking out the head note of each group, you end up with a tonic triad that ends on a cadence. And that's what makes the entire phrase a period in the typology of musical phrasing. And the claim is that in order to get this analysis, you need to first properly split this piece of music into its constituents, and grouping structure is how we do that. So because it's very hard to see what the analysis is here, I'm not sure that listening to the piece again is going to help much, but the basic idea is that you split the music into groups. From that grouping structure, you recover important musical events, and from those important musical events, you can construct an analysis of the piece in question. How are we doing for time?
You have 15 minutes more.
15 minutes, okay. So looking across these two domains, here's what I've been telling you so far. I've been telling you there are some pretty clear similarities between linguistic and musical grouping. So they both seem to have this nested hierarchical constituency structure. We tend to find constituent edges aligned to auditory gestalt disruptions in the stream of acoustic events. And the groups are said to stand in a law-governed relation to some external domain, whether that's going to be syntax or prolongational analysis, semantic interpretation, reduction graphs, whatever they are. The groups are there to interface with something external to grouping itself. I've also told you, well, I haven't told you this yet, but there's also a clear difference that comes up when you compare these two kinds of theories, and that's the direction of information flow within each theory. So in linguistic prosody, at least in the early days, this was generally cast as a function from syntactic structures and possibly other factors, pragmatic factors, theme, reading, topic, comment type structures, but a function from those syntactic and semantic structures onto prosodic constituency. and then a further function from prosodically grouped phonological representations to acoustic realizations. So we're going basically from the syntax and the semantics into a prosodic group analysis, and then a function from those groups onto the actual realization of sounds within the sound component of the grammar. Musical grouping, on the other hand, is generally cast in precisely the opposite direction, as a function from acoustic surfaces to groups, and then a function, further function from those groups to reduction or harmonic interpretation kinds of constituents. So this is what we find when we have a sort of broad level overview of these two components. There's some obvious similarities, some equally obvious differences. So today I'm going to claim that the obvious similarities, at least in Gestalt principles, are actually masking a really deep difference between music and language. Well, this thing that seems obviously different about the flow of information in grammar is actually illusory and masks deep similarities. This is going to be the claim here. See how much of this I have time to get through. So there's this first point about the directionality. The two theories are cast in starkly different terms about which way the function goes, where the information loss is. So in classical prosodic theory, and the kind of Selkirk, Nesper, and Vogel type theories from the 1980s, there's an implicit claim that this function has to go from syntactic structures onto phonology because it involves information loss. That means, in practical terms, that different syntactic structures sometimes map onto the same prosodic realization. And there's a lot of possible ways you could think about this. Some examples might be adjunct versus argument asymmetries. We know that these are representationally active in the syntax and the semantics, yet many times they don't appear to have any particular realization within the phonological component. Therefore, we better cast this function as going from the more richly informative structure to the less richly informative one. You could also say this for different types of embedded clauses and a number of other types of syntactic structures. The claim is that syntactic representations are structurally richer than prosodic ones, therefore the implicit knowledge of a speaker has to be a function in one direction. In particular, if the syntax-phonology interface is a many-to-one deterministic function, we would expect it to be difficult or impossible to reverse. So I think there's many reasons to doubt that theory, or that particular version of the theory. And this comes even from work within the same broadly generative tradition of prosodic theory. So much recent work, even by people who were the architects of that original theory, is converging on the idea that some of the superficially similar prosodic structures resulting from different kinds of syntax are not really the same even within phonology. Right? Instead, the claim is that there are often subtle prosodic differences involving nested or recursive prosodic domains that mirror the syntax more closely than had previously been believed. Much of this evidence comes from fairly intricate tonal phenomena in Bantu and other sub-Saharan African language families. It's pretty hard to see in English, although we have seen similar claims as well in Germanic and English and Germanic more broadly. That actually that prosodic structure is not quite as impoverished as we might have originally thought. And there's been a lot of work in this regard in the last 10 to 15 years, although some people, Bob Ladd was there 30 years ago. He already said this in the 1980s. But I think this is becoming more widely accepted at this point. There's also work in syntactic theory that suggests that prosody actually constrains narrowly syntactic computations. So this sharp modular split between the upstream syntactic component and the downstream phonological component that was assumed in earlier generative frameworks appears to be a little bit too strong. So it looks like prosodic systems also affect syntactic computations. There's a couple examples of this within the sort of broadly Chomskyan syntactic tradition. There's this contiguity theory development Norman Richards is largely responsible for, suggesting that narrowly syntactic properties like A-bar movement and overt WH movement, things like subjecthood and the mandatoriness of subjects are actually sensitive to language-specific phonological properties. There's other approaches to syntax, notably Mark Steedman's approach and this parallel architecture that Jackendorf has proposed that completely do away with the directionality that was originally assumed in syntax and phonology. So I think it's fair to say that neither phonology nor syntax is strictly richer than the other in informational distinctions. Beyond that, at the level of actual processing, so far everything I've said has been about the computational level properties of what we think these structures look like. But even when we look at narrowly algorithmic implementations of how you might parse these structures, it's clear that listeners can and do use these Gestalt grouping principles to recover morphological and syntactic structure from an acoustic stream. So there is some way to reverse engineer this mapping. In particular, word structure, morpheme structure, and phrase structure and segmentation are strongly constrained by acoustics. This has been shown in both infants and adults across a variety of languages. And these correspond to many of the prosodic patterns I discussed earlier: final lengthening type patterns, initial strengthening type patterns, partition lenition type patterns. Each of these has an effect on how people parse speech streams. Sentence processing itself relies heavily on prosodic cues. In fact, there's a hypothesis out there that prosodic cues are basically what tie together all levels of linguistic processing. So it's clear that listeners are able to recover rich syntactic information from listening to basically Gestalt grouping. So this is attempting to argue that the function from syntactic structures to phonological structures is not involving as much information loss as we might have originally thought. The function also appears not to be deterministic, right? And so this has been quite clear since the early days of prosodic theory. Any given utterance may map onto a variety of different prosodic realizations. And so the computational level theory of prosody will need to map syntactic structures to sets of prosodic structures or to probability distributions over prosodic structures. And the second we make that change to the theory, that means it may be fully reversible. So the claim here with language is that this function, which is classically thought of as an information-losing function from a rich syntactic component onto an impoverished prosodic component, is so simplified as to be misleading. So to the extent there's information loss in this mapping, it's information loss that goes in both directions. It's clear that the mapping from syntactic structure to sounds can be reversed by listeners. And there's no reason to suppose that one of these representations is informationally privileged over the others. What about music? Well, there's also no reason to think that directionality is crucial in many musical theories of grouping. So, in particular, the GTTM has probably been the most influential theory of grouping, and definitely the most influential theory of how grouping interacts with further musical analysis. And I've argued earlier in the work with David Brzezowski that this GTTM function, which goes from grouping structures onto harmonic analyses and tonal interpretation, can be reversed without information loss. So we argued in that earlier paper that the directionality to that mapping within their theory is formally unnecessary. That is a useful way of describing the sort of implementation of the theory that they put in their book, but you can equally well do it the other way without losing any information. What GTTM basically does is explain why, given some musical stimulus, a listener might prefer some analyses over others, which is important, of course. But if we set as a goal for our theory to eventually explain why some of these musical stimuli that we're analyzing are more common or more well-formed in the first place, which is not what Larry Hall Jackendorf set as a goal for their theory, but if we are going to do that, analogous to linguistic theory, we're going to have to reverse this function. It's necessary in order to have any purchase on what constitutes a more canonical or less marked or simpler kind of musical form. We're going to need to be able to talk about this theory in the opposite direction. So the upshot of this part, I'm claiming that while common descriptions of how grouping interfaces with other modules in the grammar differ quite a bit between language and music, I actually don't think this difference reflects anything deep or principled. I think it's largely a matter of what was convenient at the time people were writing these theories. So I'm thinking that in both domains there are going to be probabilistic associations between grouping information on the one hand and some type of syntactic or semantic information on the other hand. The mappings between grouping and these other modules will be bidirectional. So listeners are clearly capable of doing this in either direction. And the loss of information from one set of representations to the other set of representations will also be bidirectional. We'll lose some syntactic information in the prosodic component, we'll lose some prosodic information in the syntactic component, and we will do our best to work around that in both domains. So that said, let's go on to the obviously similar part of music and language that I'm going to claim is actually masking a deep difference. Okay, about 5 minutes for this. Let's see how far I go. So I've been telling you that linguistic and musical processing or parsing seem to be heavily dependent on domain general Gestalt principles. And the question naturally arises, could we just take the same kind of implementation of these Gestalt principles, take the same segmentation algorithm, and apply it to musical stimuli, or apply it to linguistic stimuli, or beats, whistles, and clicks, or cars honking out in the street? Could we apply this to any auditory domain and simply get domain general grouping out of it? If that were true, then linguistic and musical grouping wouldn't really be linguistic or musical at all. They'd just be general auditory processes. This is attractive because it would allow us to reduce some of the sort of Baroque instruction of complex elements of these theories to something much more general, just rooted in principles of human audition. So it's an attractive theory. And the idea is that we take our auditory ability to segregate streams and to segregate different types of events out there in the world. We apply them to linguistic and musical inputs, and they might interact with linguistic and musical structural components or structural modules, but the actual grouping itself would just be done by domain general auditory principles. So this would be a nice approach to this kind of grouping theory. Probably not going to work, and here's why. So linguistic and musical Gestalt grouping interact with other kinds of structure in each domain in very different ways. In particular, this sort of pure Gestalt grouping on auditory lines in language is going to be severely constrained and interfered with by metrical structure and by segmental or phonological contrasts in language. That interference is either going to be much less extensive or entirely absent in music. So what do I mean by this? Oh, and the claim here is that those differences are basically, can be traced back to the presence of a lexicon, a mental lexicon within language, which is either absent or impoverished in music. So what do I have in mind here? Well, in language, some prosodic units are more structurally prominent than others. And depending on how this manifests itself in different languages, it could be referred to as stress or accent or possibly other terms, depending on how, what the hierarchical level of prominence is. And the idea is that more temporally regular or predictable languages will have more systematic metrical stress, but metrical stress and metrical accenting is not fully predictable in any language. Most of the frequent cross-linguistic acoustic reflexes of stress are exactly the same as those that figure in grouping. So basically duration, changes in F0 in pitch, in intensity, or in timbre within groups. And what this means is that anytime I see a large change in pitch or a large change in intensity, it may be marking a prosodic group boundary, or it may just be marking a pitch accent or a stress syllable. So Gestalt grouping principles in language will need to be relativized to the metrical prominence of the material being parsed. Because we're inferring both prosodic constituency and prosodic prominence from the same set of acoustic cues, it means that there's going to be an elaborate interplay between grouping and other kinds of linguistic processing. Metrical prominence in language is marked by acoustic salience in part because it's not entirely predictable. Everything said here also applies to lexical contrast between segments within a language. So if I hear a very quiet segment, it may be the end of a prosodic group, or it may be a voiceless stop. Right? And this is just a function of lexical entries within language. This appears not to be true within music. So music metrical prominence generally is entirely temporally regular and predictable. There are limited exceptions to this, but it's certainly much more the case than in language. It tends not to be marked as consistently in acoustic terms. Eventually, the claim is that we can trace this difference back to the lexicon. So in language, we have meaningful units, lexical entries, that are memorized, stored in long-term memory, with some association to strings of meaningless units within them, strings of sounds. Those units differ in the number, the nature, and sometimes the metrical prominence of the sounds involved. That's what a lexical entry is in language. And so global patterns of metrical prominence and grouping will be irregular and highly dependent on idiosyncratic properties of lexical items. This is what's generally referred to as duality of patterning in language. In music, any given unit of syntactic or harmonic structure can be acoustically realized in a large and maybe infinite number of ways. A D minor chord, there's thousands or millions or maybe an infinite number of ways of realizing a D minor chord. Those units are not associated with an inherent number of sounds or inherent patterns of timing or metrical prominence within them. These are all things that are freely changed and expanded on within the unit of harmonic patterning. And so global patterns of metrical prominence default to total regularity and predictability. This is going to make grouping in music and grouping in language behave really differently. I'm going to end it here. I don't have time for the more speculative part about hierarchy.
You may cut the time for the questions.
Sorry?
You may cut the time for the questions.
I think if I start this now, it's going to take too long, and this part is also very speculative. But if anybody wants to know about where the hierarchy comes from, you can ask her questions.
I think yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So, any questions?
Давайте я буду по-русски, пока еще не включился. Большое спасибо за рассказ. Одно короткое замечание и короткий вопрос. Переводится? Да. Окей. Я начал с благодарности за очень интересный рассказ. Короткое замечание и короткий вопрос. Замечание такое. Методология разделения, которую предложил Джона, прозвучало предложение отделять переходы по звуковысотности, когда мы резко меняем звуковысотность, считать, что... Okay, I don't have time to English if we have a problem.
Sorry about that.
So, okay, it's not a problem. Thank you for interesting, really interesting lecture. One short remark and one short question. The remark is about this Gestalt method of dividing these short parts. And the question is about the points where the pitch of the sound is changing dramatically. Like we going to be high, and then, for example, we have partition part.
Yeah. So it changes.
So the question is that in music, I know, and I'm studying, there are two ways of using this folk music of, for example, in Jewish traditional music. I'm studying, there are two ways of changing pitch. So the first one is technical one. For example, if you are playing on a violin, you have open string, so you can use it anytime you need. It's not a changing of any phrase, you just add this open string anytime you need it. Or if you're playing flute, you can, you are playing, for example, in a second octave, you can go down an octave any moment you need, like up. It's not a change of any phrase, it's just using technically the nearest music I can go one note down or up,
Yes.
or I can change the flow of my breath in order to get the octave up or down. So that's the question. Or in other kind of tunes, vocal tunes, for example, you have really something like and this is an accent U meant. So the question is, how can we have written the text written like this? Can divide one semantic from other. And I will formulate my second question and stop. And the second more important question is, you said about semantic information in music.
Yes.
Very shortly, as I understood, you talked about chords like D minor as semantics. And the question is, if you think it's something that is common between different musical, cultures and so on, because for me, that's the greatest difference between language and music, semantics, and music text. When you were asking about dividing it into parts, is semantic, that you have semantic units in language and you don't have short semantic units, universal semantic units in musical text, and it hardly depends on culture. In some culture, is the shortest version of phrase. You cannot divide it because it's under some stress in this culture.
Mm-hmm.
So the second question, what can you talk a bit about your understanding of music semantic units, semantic information in the context of literature? Thank you.
Thank you. These are big questions, good questions. So on the first one, I would distinguish broadly between two kinds of grouping, and I think the kind of flute or open string instrument examples that you're talking about basically involves streaming. And so there's everything I've said here is about horizontal separation of groups. So this thing happens, then this thing happens, then this thing happens. There are also lots of musical traditions where there can be more than one voice going at once. And I would think of obviously there's fugues and things like that, but also just the open string type of alternations, or the flute, is that a tonguing thing when you go up and down? That kind of thing would also involve presumably more than one line or more than one voice happening at once. And so there's also going to be grouping principles for the sort of vertical separation of voices. I have not spoken about this here. There's a lot of psychological and perceptual research on how that works. And that's going to be certainly different from having a melody that's sort of progressing smoothly and then switches registers and keeps progressing smoothly. So I would think in the end that would need to be treated with an entirely different kind of perceptual constraint. Basically that the principles for separating out multiple voices unfolding simultaneously will be different than the principles for separating out different parts of a same voice. Does that make sense? Is that what you were asking about?
I talked about one voice in music. Like in playing on flute only, I can use the method, or playing violin, one voice melody, the same thing.
I'm absolutely. Yeah. But the claim is that even if you can play these on one instrument, that they're functionally segregated into different lines. That's what I mean by voice. And so the claim would be, we better also have a theory of how to recover individual melodies or lines or voices, in the abstract sense of voices, from one instrument playing things in alternation. So there's, the Bach cello sonatas would be the classical example of this, where it's almost like having a pianist with two hands playing two different melody lines, except it's all being done in alternation on a string instrument, right? And I think that's going to be a slightly different kind of grouping, although it probably has some things in common with this kind of grouping. Does that sort of, that was what you were asking about?
Okay, thank you.
And then beyond that, there's the question about semantics and how this is going to work in other musical cultures. So I didn't mean to suggest that D minor is the semantics of Western music. I think that's an important level of representation in many Western genres that's sort of intermediate between grouping and semantics. I think the safe answer within Western music would be that one kind of semantic or pre-semantic structure that you can get from pieces of music would be basically spatial metaphors. So we're in a tonal pitch space. There is a central part of the pitch space. We can progress further away from the pitch space or back towards the tonal center. We can shift into another tonal area. So I think this is one very pervasive set of semantic concepts associated with Western music. I'm not in a position to say how culturally widespread this is, although I have the impression that it is fairly common across musical genres to have these spatial metaphors involved in music. That said, it's clear that things like chords or collections of simultaneously sounded voices can't be the basis for general music cognition because they're almost entirely absent outside of Western genres, right? So that can't be what general principles of music are based upon. And I suspect that the answer to that question, I tried to avoid taking a stand on this here because it's, a very difficult question, and one that I don't know the answer to. My hope is that we can think about individual melodies or individual voices as being more of a general phenomenon that isn't limited to Western music. And in terms of, say, common practice period tonal harmony, that will be a special case where you have many voices arranged in complexes that have constraints on them that we call counterpoint. But in the general case, you could just have one voice or one melody, and there would be constraints on that and principles of how to interpret a voice. And what would make Western tonal music special is just the combination of many such voices and constraints on how they can be simultaneously realized. That said, I'm talking about what a good theory might look like that would get lots of other musical cultures in it. I don't have that theory. It's going to take years and be very difficult to do that. But does that make sense as an answer to your question, at least?
Thank you.
Other questions?
Thank you very much, Jonah. It was very, very interesting and very informative. As for me, because I am studying everyday Russian speech, I was so impressed to see many slides of you that were so similar to our language. As we have this slide, just one small remark, because to my mind, for Russian language, we would like divide gestalts in in the terms of duration in some other way, because you state length change. But what do you think if the length of Gestalt model stands to isochrony, but speech rate changes? So we have probably this kind. You see, you also have this in music notation, probably. In a way, it was just a remark.
So is the question like how you would be able to figure out the length of a linguistic event in the present?
No, I have two more small questions. It was just a remark, I don't know. Yes, and two remarks, because on your first slide with structures, you told that, yes, the grouping tends to binarity.
Yes.
What do you think about triple structures? Because it seems to me that for Russian it's also very typical. We have three combined structures, very similar. So that we have, for example, 3 plus 3, we have 6. They're binary, but 3 inside.
So this is true for like Russian stress?
No, length and grouping and prosody, they are all, I mean, in duration that we have. The duration is grouped of 3 similar parts. Yes, it's very, very typical. Okay. Probably it also have roots in Russian prosody structure, because also we have this, как это, ударная структура предложения? Rhythmic? Yes, we have stress and one stress and two unstress. The triple structure is very, very popular.
So it's it's very common at the syllable level?
Yes, yes, yes. So it was a linguistic question and one small music question.
Okay.
Yes, because...
Should I answer this first and then do the second, or should we do both at once?
Yes, all together.
Okay.
And the third one, the last question is that, you know, that music differs a lot because of genres. And the most similarity is between vocal music, sure, and the language. And to my mind, as for Russian, the most similarity we have between Russian speech and songs by Sergei Rachmaninoff. The most similarity. Do you have some ideas what about American? So,
well,
thank you.
I can definitely answer the first one. I can maybe speculate about the second one. So for the first question, this is why I said there's a tendency towards binarity, and especially at higher levels of constituency, because it's clear in both language and music there are genres or pieces or languages that have a ternary rhythm, especially at lower levels of the tree. There are Amazonian languages that clearly have stress systems that group strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak. So Cayuga is such a system. I had not been aware of Russian having sort of ternary stress, but it certainly wouldn't surprise me. I think of Russian as having incredibly unpredictable stress.
Oh no.
But yeah, I mean, I could be.
It depends on Gestalt.
Okay, it depends on Gestalt.
And semantics, of course.
So I certainly wouldn't rule out the possibility of ternary groupings at lower levels. In music, interestingly, if you look at least within Western genres that I'm familiar with, including jazz, pop music, most classical pieces and waltz time, if you look really carefully at the occurrence of events or the fine details of their timing in a performance, in those systems, which in Western music are generally organized strong, weak, weak, that third beat, the weak beat, often ends up being slightly stronger than the one before it. And so this is true, but notes that are sounded there tend to be a little bit longer. It's more likely for notes to be sounded there in the general case. And there are some studies suggesting that people might have more attentional load, or at least be attending more carefully to those third beats than to the second beats in such systems. And I mention this only because I think it raises the possibility that those ternary systems in music might actually be recursively binary, that there's actually 3 different strengths of beat within those triple times. Whether that's going to be true for all ternary rhythms, I'm not sure. But I've certainly seen evidence for that in some musical genres. So I think it would raise the question of whether that might be true in language as well. I'm not in a position to answer that. But certainly, I wouldn't want to rule out true ternary rhythms at a low level in either speech or language. The binarity comes in as a tendency at the syllabic level in language, and as a much stronger tendency at levels above syllables, basically. As for the second thing, so the claim is that Rachmaninoff specifically has like a Russian kind of rhythm to his music.
Russian vocal music resembles Russian everyday speech in many different ways.
In many different ways. So I'm not expert enough on specific Russian composers to be able to address that in any kind of expert detail. I know there's been a fair bit of research suggesting that some rhythmic aspects of composed music, even non-vocal music, even instrumental music, reflects some aspects of the spoken rhythm of language in question. So I'm thinking in particular, I think some of this research was done by Anirudh Patel, showing that French instrumental music has different patterns of global variability that in some sense mirror corpora of spoken French as compared to English composers and spoken English. Whether that actually is causal, I think, is an open question, and the specific details of what the properties are that differ, I think are also open questions, but there does seem to be some effect of the native language of a composer on non-instrumental music, so it would be extremely surprising if that didn't also extend to vocal music, right? As to what would make music sound specifically, vocal or non-vocal music sound specifically Russian or specifically English, I just don't know enough
to really propose anything about that. But the things that have been singled out in previous literature basically involve the variability of note lengths, and specifically the variability of consecutive notes within a piece. Is it going to be more uniform or less uniform? And this is also something that you can do with linguistic syllables. The claim is that there's some parallel between these two modes. So it seems entirely consistent with the idea that these are both rooted in Gestalt perception somehow. That said, it's very hard to come up with specific predictions about how Russian vocal music ought to be and how, American vocal music ought to be. But it is an interesting question.
Thank you. I'm afraid we need to stop here.
Thank you very much.